everybody. Welcome to the Ego episode. We're very excited for this one. I know I say this probably every podcast. I think that's a fair assumption. But I'm really excited for this because I think that whether you have had conversations about the ego before, whether you're extremely familiar or not familiar at all, I think this episode has something for everyone. And I'm really excited. At the end, I'm kind of gonna throw a little curveball into the conversation on a different sort of perspective and approach to ego. So stay tuned for that. If you're new here, my name is Lydia, and we're all just figuring out as it goes, and conversations help us along the way. So, let's get it going. What is the ego? According to psychologytoday.com, the ego stems from Freudian psychology. From Freud's theory, the ego is, I'm quoting here, the part of the personality that arbitrates between the animalistic desires of the id and the moral and social standards of the superego. And, little fun fact, Freud never even actually used the word ego. What Freud was using apparently translated to the I, as in, I am talking right now, what we refer to as the I, the me, the self. Now, this is just one theory. From, I think, a more Eastern spiritual perspective, Deepak Chopra explains that the ego, this I, is not who you really are. The ego is your self-image. It is your social mask. It is the role you are playing. Your social mask thrives on approval. It wants control, and it is sustained by power because it lives in fear. I love that Deepak Chopra uses the word mask because I think that really hits the nail on the head. In some forms, our ego is this sort of mask that even, I think, up until we become aware of our egos, logically, the concept, and then also in practice, how it shows up in our lives, it is a sort of mask that's almost been like welded to our face in that sense. In A New Earth, Eckhart Tolle, I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce his last name, talks a lot about the roles we play as well. So, again, I think Chopra's kind of defining of the ego also hits that point, which I love too. This idea that we play into certain roles, what it is to be a friend based on what messaging we're getting from our immediate experience and media, society, etc. A partner, a significant other, a mother, a father, a good employee, whatever that might mean, all these different roles that we're playing. Because I think perhaps so long as we're not showing up authentically, we're playing a role, we're filling a role. Because I think that, and I've kind of said this in different episodes, how I fill the role of a friend in my authenticity is through my Lydia-ness. I am a Lydia friend in that sense. And in that sense, it's beautiful because no one can be a Lydia friend but me if I'm doing it authentically. But if I'm not being authentic and, 100% in that sense, anyone can be a friend. Anyone can fill that role. And I, I hope that doesn't sound threatening. Like, if you're not being authentic, you're replaceable. To me, that highlights how important it is to be authentic, because that's where our gift comes in. We can get a friend anywhere, but can anyone get this friendship with me? No. So that's beautiful. That's a gift. And in A New Earth, if you're interested in learning more about this concept of masks and roles within a framework that will lead you to understanding how to navigate and release them for authenticity, 10 out of 10 recommend the book. Link is in the show notes. And I've also linked a video that a YouTube channel After School did from a speech Jim Carrey gave at a commencement, talking all about this and kind of touching more so on, the fear aspect of the ego, love, all that kind of different stuff, and what an alternative path might look like. So, some materials for you there. All right. When I asked on our Instagram a few weeks ago at reself.ing, as in reselfing, we have changed our name. I framed this conversation in terms of the ways our ideas of self limit us. So I kind of wanted to dive a little into that and kind of exploring what it looks like to recognize the ego and how ego, our masks, our roles, our ideas of self, as opposed to just simply our unlimited authenticity, limits us through the multiple examples I can flesh out from my own experience. First of all, I think that social media actually serves as a great example of ego expression, of expression from the ego, for almost anyone using it in a sense. And I think that we can use it consciously, which I think perhaps is, I hope, that's the direction we're going, because I think we're really coming to terms with the shortcomings and the toxicity of the way social media is used right now. But I think, just come with me. Let's talk about this. When using social media, we choose what we want to show people, period. We can be conscious about it and intentional in different ways, constructing our persona or simply trying to be completely authentic with it. But that construction, choosing what we show people, that's the ego. And I think even in that authentic expression, ego can show up too, because we're still trying to construct an image of self. And I think in that construction lies the ego, because we're still communicating a persona, in the sense that I think it's the fault of the medium, of the platform of social media. You're not just living, but you're publishing in that sense from your living, and so you are constructing, and I think the ego is involved in that 100%. So we create a persona, a mask. We decide the role we want to play, the role that we want to communicate. And like I said, it's not necessarily even something done consciously or maliciously. But I think that social media is an extension and perfect example of ego, because it comes from that unconscious place. But we can also, like I just said, we can also get conscious about it. So, for example, in high school, I quit using social media. I don't have personal social media now. I deleted all my personal accounts once I realized, among the other flaws and shortcomings of social media and its toxicity, that I was doing exactly that. I had a persona, and now this persona, what I was communicating on social media, was absolutely a part of me, but it was only one dimension or a couple dimensions of my multiplicity, of the multiplicity that we all have. And so, in that sense, I was playing into those dimensions, and they were becoming like hyper dimensions, hyper aspects of self, communicating and reproducing it. And I realized how effed up that was to me. And I didn't want to do it anymore, because I think that whether it was just a moment of awareness, I think it breeds a felt disconnect between who we are and our profiles online. And I think that's just painful. I was going to say it's dangerous, and it's certainly dangerous, but I think most of all it's simply painful. And as a reminder, and I think this is also a great example about the ego, right? You, me, we don't have to participate in it. I said this in a few episodes ago. Just because everyone's doing it doesn't mean it's right. And just because everyone else is doing it doesn't mean that you have to. You don't have to put that mask on. You don't have to fill that role. See, social media, anything that's so one dimensional, literally on a screen, one dimensional as well, especially as images, even videos, though, cannot inherently communicate our multidimensionality. And that's a simple failure to everyone involved. And sure, like, I'm generalizing because I think that some longer form platforms can do better than others, but in general, it simply doesn't beat our authentic, multidimensional, in person expression. Or perhaps instead of even just in person expression, our unedited expression, our unfiltered expression, our expression of life through our experience. Like I've kind of said, it's not necessarily even our fault, but once we're aware of it, and I think that's where we are right now, too, as a society, and also, I'm sure, as anyone listening to this, I think it becomes part of the journey of self mastery to be able to recognize it and be discerning about how and when we act from the ego, and being able to call ourselves out on that once we notice it, and to choose authentic, unfiltered expression instead. And that's all part of the journey. So the next thing is that simply the ego can block us from trying new things. And here's our example to this. When I was in college, my school had a rock climbing wall. That was pretty cool. As a kid, rock climbing on actual rocks was something that always fascinated me. And I think from that point, as a child into who I was in college, my interest had drifted away from that realm towards fashion and art, and naturally I identified with those things as part of myself. So among other reasons, I never went rock climbing while I was in college. I was thinking about this the other day, which is why I'm using this as an example, because I was trying to understand, like, I think rock climbing is sick. If I had the opportunity, I would absolutely go. So why, all in college, when I had the opportunity, did I not go? And this is what I've landed on. I'm not afraid to try new things. I like doing things alone. So it was nothing of that, sort of aspect. But I think when our quote unquote identity perhaps is far enough away from something, it becomes easy to not do it or to not relate to it. And so, already I think an example, right? I said I identified with certain interests I had, right? Well, those are just interests of mine. They aren't my identity, right? So that's the ego. Like saying I am outdoorsy or I am not a reader. When we say those things, we declare them as identity, but they're not actually who we are. They are simply things we do or don't do, or are interested in or not interested in. If the ego is the I, identifying with roles and masks, then the alternative is the witness, who we are as awareness, the witness to our lives in that sense, because we are both the I, having this personal experience, and we are also the witness of the I. When we choose awareness, when we operate from the witness seat of our experience, we can call out our ego when it's holding us back from trying something new or from understanding a situation with more clarity, empathy, understanding, love, forgiveness, etc. So it's really about going outside of the identity, of the self, of the masks, of the roles that our ego clings to. Because when we do, we touch a deeper experience, a deeper freedom. We realize we don't need to cling, we don't need to wear masks, and we can choose to not play into these roles. And I think even when we try new things, for example, like I took jazz and ballet in college with no prior dance training, we still have to deal with the ego in other ways. It still shows up in other ways. We have to overcome it. If you're interested in that example, you can listen to our episode where I talked to my dance professor, Amy. The benefit then to trying new things, in addition to simply getting to try new things, which is exciting and stimulating and fun and challenging in all good ways, it becomes an exercise, really, in recognizing our ego and exercising our discernment with our ego and being able to say, this is coming from my ego right now. I'm going to choose to respond, or I'm going to give it space and time so that I can distance myself enough. I can get into the witness seat and I can kind of discern what's really going on here. And here's another example that I just recently came face to face with again. I've talked about this briefly before in another episode. I can't remember if it's in the Proust questionnaire or Waking Up or one of our first episodes. But, as I also just mentioned, I love fashion. Since I was 8 or 9, I figured I would work in fashion in whatever capacity that shifted to over the years as, my own passions developed. When I interned with my dream house to work for, I realized that this was an ego thing. And let me explain. You see, when I thought about it, as we can all think about and examine our ego, I realized that the house that I was interning for gave my ego a name to associate with, a sort of status and stature. I wasn't happy while I was doing my internship. On a deeper level, the internship I enjoyed the people I was around, but on a very deep level, I felt unfulfilled, unsatisfied, and unhappy, which was my intuition telling me something was out of alignment here. And yet, at the same time, I was planning the life I would live while I was in New York City, a place I figured I would eventually live, what neighborhood I was going to live in, even the personas of the neighborhoods and what persona fit me and my, what it also communicated about me, the clothes I would buy. And yet at the same I was living that life already literally during my internship and I wasn't happy. But my ego wanted to fulfill its desires. It wanted the job, it wanted the neighborhood, it wanted the city, it wanted the clothes. Everything it knew people would covet and want for themselves, and thus, in that twisted, egoic, social sense, it would have respect from people. And that's the thing, is that respect is like envy. It's not real respect. Personally, and I think this shows the great contradiction, I think, between our egos and our authentic self. For me, and perhaps this resonates for you, I'm someone who's, since I was young, I've kind of always been like, F social approval, I don't want social approval, I don't need social approval. And so for me, in my ego, that shows up, I think, as, to be completely honest, I think that shows up as like what I just described to you, where people would covet and want that life, what I was doing and living and being, but I didn't necessarily want the approval, I wanted the envy. That's the ego. And that's how, for me, I think the ego shows up. Versus a non egoic existence, which is just to each their own. And I'm going to do me in my lane and you do you in your lane. And I can wave from my lane and, tip my hat to you. And you can wave from your lane and tip your hat to me. And I'll send you light and love and you send me light and love. And, we can both have respect for each other. And in that sense, reverence for each other. Again, what I described to you there in terms of that example, is that what I was consciously thinking? Of course it was not what I was consciously thinking. I'm holding up the mirror of my experience for you. I think the most powerful thing is that what I've learned is if it rubs you the wrong way, that's probably your ego. That's what we can begin to inquire about within ourselves. The ego doesn't like to get called out, it feels attacked. But the more we can sit and question where this reaction is coming from, the more we can call it out, the less attached and associated we are with it. It's kind of just like something we're living with. And the easier it becomes to say, oh, that's my ego, you sly dog ego, and go from there without the ego controlling you. Because especially I want to say, because I think this is personally where I'm at in my life right now. During that internship and once I graduated college, twice I think I came face to face with a life I could have had, right? And I didn't like what flashed before my eyes. And within myself, I felt that disconnect and that I just couldn't do it. And obviously, I felt called to other things, creating Reself and what I'm doing now. I think the more in micro ways, really, because I think, I'm going to acknowledge what we're talking about is pretty big and can be very scary stuff in the sense of choosing career, choosing a place to live, who you surround yourself with, la la la. But I think when we can call our ego out in micro ways throughout the day, whether it's how I respond to a family member or respond to someone who cuts me off in traffic, react rather than respond, really. I can just begin to witness and choose a different response from my authentic expression. I think that is what builds up not only self esteem, because that's what builds up self esteem, but also that's what's going to build up that power, that empowerment, that when we are faced with quote unquote big decisions, macro decisions like a job, a place to live, whatever, we can choose what is authentic to us rather than the path of the ego. Which I think then brings us to the fact that, especially in spirituality, you hear a lot of people talk about the ego in terms of killing the ego deaths, all that stuff. So why do people talk about, why are people talking about ego death and killing your ego? Well, like we kind of just said, the ego seems to really get a lot, in the effing way a lot of the time. And that's not wrong. In that sense, I think when we're in that existence of unconscious egoism, it's getting in the way of knowing reality, of knowing each other, of knowing the universe, of knowing our existence more deeply and honestly. So then it would make sense to eradicate it, right? Well, I would like to propose an alternative route, one of a sort of ego integration, cohabitating with the ego, if you may. Because listen, like Freud's psychological theory, it's, whether it's Freud, whether it's Carl Jung, it's a part of us to our, understanding. So I'm going to call on two awesome people who have given me great material to work with here. The first is Heinz. His video, which I have linked in the show notes, I Quit My Spiritual Journey for a New One, is going to lay this out for us. Basically, in the video, he kind of just explains, look, we are souls, we are spirits, we are having this journey of a human experience. not necessarily a human having a spiritual experience, right? So, if you're like me, if you're like Heinz, and if you ascribe to a specific religious tradition, I think this is translatable into any tradition. From wherever we came from, we are here having this human experience, right? When I first listened to this video from Heinz, it reminded me that I shouldn't push away being human for this idea of being spiritual. This idea that being a spiritual being in this human experience is better or like a higher experience. And so, in that same sense, he highlights how along our, quote unquote, spiritual journey, so to speak, we devalue our human experience. We forget that we're here on earth. We all have a purpose here. So, our spiritual journey, he says, is a sort of recognizing that we are a spirit, that we have souls, that we are something more in a sense. We came from creation itself and the source of creation, and we will return to there, so to speak. So we dive into that, and with that, we recenter, I think, from the perspective of reckoning with the idea that there is a deeper element to our existence than what meets the eye. And he highlights that in the spiritual community, there's a sort of hierarchy. And I mean, literally, literally the word hierarchy, right? Like, not only is that just so human of us to create a spiritual hierarchy, but that's also the ego. If we're partaking in spiritual practices and still, he says, doing, speaking, perpetuating any sort of like hierarchy, hatred, ignorance, separation, instead of embodying love, compassion, empathy, then we're not embodying that spiritual element of us that is simply just unconditional love. So spirituality isn't outside of us, it's within us. We're already spiritual. If you want to go there, like we're spiritual beings having a human experience. We connect back with that spiritual essence by being present, by being aware, intentional, and practicing things that help us center and touch that purity, which is always available to us within us. What he's really highlighting here, finally, he says, if we want to be more spiritual, let's love each other. Love your neighbor, love strangers, love your enemy, embody love and forgiveness and compassion and empathy. And I use all of this because that's what's so hard for the ego. That's how we integrate this deep contradiction within ourselves with our multitudes. And let me let me just say for the record, I've quoted Whitman before, and here we go again. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. We are walking contradictions. We contain multitudes. We have egoism and separatism, and we also have unity and interconnection all within us and around us. We think we need to put ourselves into boxes under labels to smooth out our contradictions, but the truth is we don't. And in my experience, when we don't, when we just let ourselves exist in contradiction in our multitudes, we give ourselves that freedom to be internally contradictory, to contain the multitudes that we contain. And I think we just rest easier at night. We have chaos within. We have access to clarity. We have complete stillness within. We, to quote Alice in Wonderland, we are all mad here. The trick of society is that it tries to package all this madness up, and it's masquerading its madness as sanity that's really insane. What is sane about being inauthentic? What is sane about the inner turmoil that creates? When we accept this, we are reconciling The ego's need for masks, roles, approval, fear. Because what's the fear? That we're crazy? That people will judge us? That we're unlovable? Let me ask you this. What's worse? The judgment and hatred of others? Or the judgment and hatred of self because we are not being true to ourselves? That's the ego's greatest trick. It promises happiness, stability, sanity if we put masks on, if we occupy roles, if we get social approval. But this leaves us empty. Which brings us to, in an interview with Big Sean, which I've also linked in the show notes, he's asked what his biggest lesson has been in the past 12 months. Big Sean says, "You can't kill your ego. Why would you want to kill a part of yourself anyway? You have to just know how to work with it and how to treat it. People always say your ego is your most childish part of you. But then I also hear that children are the most spiritual beings because they have no restrictions that have been set on them. They're just purely right from the source. So there has to be a connection between the two. And I think your ego is an unfiltered part of you that is easily affected and very emotional, very sensitive, and it's something you should embrace. Instead of trying to get rid of it, lock it in a room, you embrace it and recognize it for what it is. And when you do, when you nurture it in that way, I think it won't be as dramatic of an outlash and as damaging to you." So there's a lot to unpack there. It's almost easier to have this idea of quote unquote kill your ego than to learn how to work with it, how to treat it, how to recognize it and notice it, integrate it, and choose authenticity instead. And we've talked about this before, if you've listened to our other conversations. I really think the goal, in so many ways, like Big Sean alludes to, is to return to a childlike state. In our episode on authentic integrity, I talked about this. Nietzsche talks about the child as the final stage of the metamorphosis. As we develop, our egos develop. But no one's teaching us how to navigate this development and how to understand it and recognize the ego when the ego is getting in our way and how to work with it. In line with what Hines was saying earlier, right? Wherever we come from, whatever we are, right now we're having this human experience. Enjoy this. Enjoy being human. Explore it. Embrace it. Why would you want to kill a part of yourself anyway? Why would we deny our reality in this sense? That the reality is we have the ego. So, in that sense, perhaps it's a built in lesson to overcome separation internally so we can overcome separation externally in the external world. There's a great quote from the Dalai Lama: "We can never obtain peace in the outer world until we make peace with ourselves." So the ego is like this awesome built-in lesson for us to learn how to navigate the illusion of separation, the illusion of social approval, the illusion of masks and roles and fear. We can embrace our spiritual nature, our higher self, the soul essence, while at the same time being human. That's the beauty of this experience. I think that's the goal here because we are human. This human experience is here to experience, to learn from, to leave this world a little better than when we first arrived here. And I think when we can do that, when we can dance in our contradictory nature, in our multitudes, we are just flexible with who we quote unquote are. And in being flexible, in suspending the self image, the masks, the roles, the quote unquote I that we identify with, the I that identifies with its interests rather than simply being interests, we can shift more easily because we accept our contradictions, our multiplicity. And we benefit immensely because we can slowly become aware of the masks and roles that we play and wear, and we take them off and put them down one by one, becoming more free each time, more authentic, more flexible, more expansive, more light, as in unencumbered and not being weighed down by how heavy it is to walk around with all these masks, to know how to play all these roles, to simply just be able to show up and express. And in doing all that, we can evolve. We are unlimited. We touch what we have always been, which is unlimited potential to be and do anything. And I think that's part of that return to the childlike self. Because children, right, in that sense of what Big Sean was saying, children are so pure because they come right from the source. So that's really, in that sense, the return to that purity, not of not having experience, because I think the beauty of being an adult is having experience and at the same time being able to be completely discerning about being authentic and your ego and how your ego is getting in your way and choosing how you show up and getting to be both wise and mature and at the same time childish as hell. There's our conversation for you. Lots of food for thought, lots of great uh, tidbits in the show notes to explore. So 10 out of 10, check them out, recommend them. Thank you for taking the time to sit and chat with me today, for giving yourself this opportunity to expand and release. If you're into stuff like this, really recommend signing up for the Reself waitlist and monthly recalibrate email where you'll have the opportunity to set intentions and check yourself, check your ego, whatever you need. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have a beautiful week. Oh, how could I almost forget? Per usual, follow us on Instagram, Pinterest, Tumblr, whatever floats your boat. And I'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.